Barbara Charles, a longtime member of the Ephemera Society, and somebody who protested the war. I have the pleasure of introducing Jen Hoyer, and Jen is the Technical Services and Electronics Librarian at CUNY, New York City College of Technology, and I had to ask her, what does that mean? And it means that she oversees the catalogers of all the collections and makes sure all the databases run. Jen has a master's degree also from CUNY in American Studies and a master's degree in library science from McGill. And she's been a longtime volunteer at the Interface Archives in Brooklyn, which particularly deals with, I would say, radical and younger people and more contemporary issues. And she's been, as you can read in the brochure, she has written many articles and publications about this material. Her statement that I find most interesting is, while my research looks at ephemera created in moments and spaces of conflict, the fact of its creation by teenagers themselves, and that's what she'll be talking about, really points to a larger debate over who can participate and love and be active in all this material. And so she really, on this talk, High School Students Unite, looking at early radicalism, I would say, among younger people in high school in the 1960s. And I think it's a perfect segue from the material that Stuart just was showing us. Jen, you're on.
Thank you so much. And while we get my slides up, I'll just, say a little more to contextualize how I will be talking about this material today. I am a librarian and archivist, and in addition to spending a lot of time working with these kinds of collections, I've spent a lot of time teaching with these kinds of collections, and so my thinking about this material is informed by that. Are you going to help with the slides? Thank you. Sorry, I'm so sorry. No, it's okay. And so today I want to think specifically about how our analysis of ephemera can tell us something about participation and about power dynamics. And I'm looking at a really specific context. So I'm looking at leftist activism by high school students in and around New York City in the 60s. But I'm really curious, and maybe we can talk about this after, how some of the themes that I bring out apply to other contexts that you all think more about. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this in this room, but I don't personally collect things. I spend a lot of time working with institutional collections to make sure that they're really available for people to learn from and teach with. So, thank you. Today, the genesis of all of my thinking around this started with a collection of material at Interference Archive in Brooklyn that I worked to digitize and make freely available online through the JSTOR Reveal digital collections. So a lot of this stuff, not that thing, but a lot of this stuff is freely available online. And then I've also included some material from the Penina Coopersmith collection at the NYU Special Collections and Archives. And there are a few items as well that are in private collections. They are in the collections of the people who made them, and I've worked with those folks to put them in exhibits and things like that. So I've included them here. So what I'm going to do is guide us through a really close analysis of material culture produced by high school students and about high school issues in the 60s. This material looks at how students understood their role in wider conflicts of the time. So that does include the Vietnam War, also the civil rights movement, struggles for open admissions, et cetera. And those struggles, those conflicts are really interesting, but the conflict that I see emerging through all of this is a struggle by high school students for self-determination in their own organizing. So who was deciding the priorities for their activism, whose opinions about high school students were actually being disseminated? And I use the word participation a lot, which I want to highlight because in the 60s, participatory democracy was this buzzword that had been originated by SNCC, but really popularized by Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. But one of the things that I think was a huge fracture in SDS and a huge space for debate at the time was, what did participatory democracy mean? Who really got to participate and how? And so we see that in all of this material, and my analysis is guided by a set of questions that I'll ask about every piece we look at. Who made this? Who did they make it for, and why did they make it? And so my hope is that by asking those questions, we can have these conversations about power and agency and self-determination. So I'm going to start by asking that about this poster. Who made this? So this poster was printed by a collective that came together in May 1970 to occupy Kimball Hall at New York University. It's a 17 by 22 poster. This collective occupied the print shop at Kimball Hall, and they invited students and non-students, including a radical printing collective called WIMP, or Workers in Movement Printing. They made use of the equipment and the supplies until they used up all the supplies, even printing posters on the backs of sheets of uncut letterhead. The graphic on this poster was designed by Tom Lindsay, who was a member of New York's High School Student Union. And the graphic circulated really widely, but the words "on strike" were added to this specific poster in the context of the May 1970 student strike. So high school students were invited into the print shop to make use of that occupied space, and so they were likely also part of the effort to print the poster beyond just providing the design. Now, who was this made for, and why did they make it? This was made by high school students and their allies to support the broader May 1970 movement, following the murder of 4 students at Kent State. And I would love to speak more, I will speak more about the individuals involved in that, but I want to take a few steps back in time, actually outside New York City a little bit. We are in Hartford, Connecticut, looking at this ticket for a benefit concert at Weaver High School. And we can't really ask a lot of questions looking at this. This is just like the size of a business card. It's letterpress printed. But I have a flyer about this on the next slide as well. So the students at Weaver High School had a concert in August 1963 to benefit the Northern Student Movement. Who made this? This flyer and the preceding ticket were made by students at the high school. Who did they make it for? Now, these students were raising funds for the Northern Student Movement, which was a civil rights organization founded by students at Yale. And the Yale students organized others in the North to help with some fundraising and local efforts, mostly involved with direct action and voter registration in the South. Why did they make it? I understand these 2 pieces related to the Hootenanny as expressions of solidarity. So the Northern Student Movement itself is in solidarity with SNCC in the South, and then these students are in solidarity with the Northern Student Movement. And so participation at this moment for high school students looks like high school students demonstrating solidarity with other organizing led by university students. Having kind of taken this step back in time to earlier in the 60s, what we see here is material produced by high school students on behalf of causes outlined by other organizations, and this is an additional example. This is just a saddle-stitched flyer printed on 8.5 by 11 sheets. It's written by Mark Kleiman, a high school student in California. He wrote the contents of the flyer on behalf of SDS, which was primarily college student-led. And this was printed in 1966, and Kleiman explores the oppression of high school students and suggests anti-authoritarian solutions. Now, who is this made for? This is a little tricky because in places it seems directed to high school students, but in other places it really seems like it's still a mouthpiece of college students. It's bridging this weird gap of like trying to convince SDS that they should actually pay attention to high school students, and trying to also convince high school students to give their energy to SDS. This was produced at an era when SDS was beginning to realize that high school students mattered. They really struggled to connect with high school students, but in this flyer, the tactic they've used is getting a high school student to be their mouthpiece so that they can convince other young people to get involved. So thinking about what the material so far shows us, I started with this because it represents this point of emergence of high school students beginning to have a voice, but it's not always necessarily their own, and they're beginning to participate, but typically on the terms of other organizations that are larger and don't have the interests of high school students as their main priority. And so I want to look at a few other conceptualizations of participation. We just looked at a flyer put out by SDS, organizing high school students with the voice of another high school student being used, but they also put out material about high school and middle students without even involving those students. So who made this flyer? This was produced by SDS in New York City. And who is it made for? SDS made this flyer around 1966 as well on behalf of individuals in the school community at IS 201. Now the thing that is really interesting about this is a very niche thing to recognize, but IS 201 means Intermediate School 201. And IS is, if you see like on New York City public schools, there's JHS and there's MS and there's IS, and everyone's like, what's going on with all these different types of middle schools? ISs were created at this moment in time to shift the grade range of middle school in order to help facilitate integration. So technically, the creation of this school was to help with integration. But the problem that was happening is they'd had a really terrible principal assigned to the school. So SDS comes in to organize around this issue, but we see a really interesting dynamic that follows on what we've already seen. SDS is organizing on behalf of the younger students, but the younger students are not being invited to actually participate in crafting the organizing agenda about those concerns or articulating them. There are no middle or high school students involved in putting this together. But SDS wasn't the only group maybe exploiting younger people and their concerns. A lot of other groups started becoming cognizant of grade school students, and yet continued to sort of dictate participation. So who made this flyer? This is made by the Student Mobilization Committee to End the War, commonly referred to as MOB. They organized a high school student mobilization committee to end the war in Vietnam, so like a subset of themselves. And so who is this made for? The goal of this flyer is to bring high school students to an anti-war march as part of the larger MOB organization. Why did they make this? This is another great example of organizations realizing that high school students represent like this enormous wealth of untapped energy. And we could view this as larger organizations lending their infrastructure and knowledge to support high school activists. I tend to be more cynical about that, and I really see this as co-optation, again, of high school student energy to strengthen larger non-student organizations. Students are being invited to participate on MOB's terms and not on their own. Again, as another example, this is produced by the Young Socialist Alliance, which is a Trotskyist arm of the Socialist Workers' Party. Who is this made for? High school students. And why did they make it? Similarly to what MOB was doing, the goal of this flyer is to recruit high school students to the YSA's organizing cause, and not necessarily to support any agenda that is emerging from high school students themselves. And as one more example of that, this flyer was produced by the Fifth Avenue Vietnam Peace Parade Committee based in New York City. Who did they make it for? The Peace Parade Committee made this to recruit individuals to take part in anti-war rallies during the August 1968 DNC in Chicago. And why did they make it? Again, this is another big organization recruiting high school students to support their own cause. So to pause and ask what all of these things show us so far, while I noted on the first few pieces of ephemera that high school students were starting to realize they have a voice, these last several items really show us how other organizations recognize that potential and are trying to direct it towards their own cause. And this is, to me, where the conflict is starting to be clearer. How can high school students be allowed to voice concerns? Whose concerns do they get to voice? And on the material we've looked at so far, they're being spoken for, or they're being asked to support other organizations. They're spoken at more often than they are actually allowed to speak. This co-optation of students erupts in some pushback by students themselves, and we start to see that their own voices coming through on ephemera that's created for some of those larger organizations, but simultaneously by high school students themselves. So this is a mimeographed sheet that was printed by the New York High School Student Union, but their plea for money includes a description of upcoming events organized by the Peace Parade Committee, who we previously saw here, and they're selling buttons for the Peace Parade Committee. So who printed this flyer? One really interesting thing about the Peace Parade Committee is, while this was probably mimeographed at their office, it was most likely printed by high school students, because the Peace Parade Committee was actually a space where a lot of high school students in New York got their first jobs. If they were really lefty activists, it was where they found their activist home. They learned to use mimeograph machines there, and that would come in super handy later on. I have read many interviews with young 14 and 15-year-old activists of that era who were like, yeah, my first job was printing flyers for the Peace Parade Committee. And so this suggests that our previous flyer from the Peace Parade Committee may have been printed by high school students as well. Now, who did they make it for, and why did they print it? These students were interested in supporting the anti-war movement, but they recognized that selling buttons for this demonstration that they're outlining here, that's organized by the Peace Parade Committee, is actually a way to raise funds for their own autonomous student group. So ultimately, this flyer illustrates something new. Readers are being asked to support the larger anti-war movement, but there's an ulterior motive of raising funds to support an organization that high school students can run on their own terms. I'm actually going to come back to that one, sorry. It's great, though. We'll be back there in a minute. And we also saw a flyer from the Peace Parade Committee about organizing to go to the DNC in Chicago, but high school students actually decided to go on their own. A lot of them did. So the flyer gives some info to high school students who want to join a group that'll carpool and get to Chicago together. The flyer is produced by ROC, the Radical Organizing Committee, and they explain that they've actually split from MOB, whose flyers we saw earlier. I mean, there was a lot of splitting going on here, so we can connect all these groups somehow. But they identify as students and as independents, and they're getting ready to organize alongside the Peace Parade Committee with their own carpools. Who is this made for? This flyer is intended to organize students, mostly in high school, also a bit in college. And beyond just organizing students to go to the DNC protest, they're also inviting high school students to become members of ROC, the Radical Organizing Committee. So we see this shift here of participation, of high school students being activists on their own terms, setting goals and agendas, and deciding how to take part in these larger movements. And while a lot of students went to the DNC in August '68 in Chicago, they came back to start school, and in New York City they did not really start the school year because they came home to this months-long teacher strike over the Ocean Hill-Brownsville community control crisis. And so this is a flyer that was produced in that moment in support of the community control district that was at the heart of that dispute. So who made this? This flyer identifies a whole bunch of high school groups that have worked together on producing it. There's the High School Student Union, the WEB Du Bois Clubs, SDS, Youth Against War and Fascism, the ROC, whose flyer we just saw. And in the context of our bigger discussion about who gets to participate and who has a voice about the concerns of high school students, I really like how just that list down at the bottom of who is involved in making this flyer is already showing that there's a really diverse diverse community of many groups of high school students who are speaking for themselves. And then our next piece of ephemera here proclaims the formal creation of the High School Student Union at a convention in September 1968. This is just a folded single sheet, 8.5 by 11. Who made this? This is produced by the High School Student Union. They came together to protest both the war, but also more localized oppression in their own schools. and they formed to demand these changes together. Who is it for? It's mostly for other high school students, although I think there's some info at the very end about how other people can give them money. And the High School Student Union quickly launched their high school free press. This is the first issue from October 1968. And it includes some reflections from the August DNC and on the teachers' strike going on in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. Who made this and who's it made for? On the masthead of this, they proclaimed that it was produced by and for New York City high school students. They actually got permission to use the New York Free Press and New York Review of Sex offices after hours to do their layout, and they worked out an agreement with their printers. So they didn't have their own office space, but they were using the space of other radical publications. And what's really interesting is that when I talked with one of the founders of the High School Student Union, Howie Swerloff, he explained to me that the student union revolved around the newspaper and not the other way around. So like production of print ephemera was really at the core of their expression of activism. And this is where, as we trace along this conflict here, whether and how high school students get to have a say in what their participation looks like, in the midst of all of this co-optation of high school student energy and attempts to align their priorities with other groups, this publication really stands out as an assertion of agency and of self-determination. And I'm going to go back quickly to this great one. So even while they were printing their own newspaper, they were also putting out some internal newsletters. This one was published, it was actually published in early 1969, even though it says 68 on it. It's really just for internal members. Who is it made by and for? This is an 8.5 by 21 broadsheet, and it was created to bring together high school students across the city. So while students actually across the country were getting their hands on the High School Free Press, this was really still for folks in New York City. And it was helping them coordinate fundraising, connecting different locals that were being created in different schools, setting up new locals, supporting the creation of other underground publications at specific schools. And they have a note specifically in their newsletter that the High School Free Press, which we just saw, was going to be expanding its circulation to 50,000 per issue, which among other alternative and radical publications at the time is not insignificant. They were really doing well. And then go back to where we were. This is just another one of their newsletters. Again, internal communication. That High School Free Press would keep printing until at least 1970, but we do simultaneously still see these internal newsletters. So again, who is this for? This is really just for students who are still just in New York City, coordinating their own events and supporting each other. And so as high school students are really asserting themselves, we also see them start to take the lead on collaborating with these bigger organizations that had been sort of co-opting them before. And this flyer highlights an anti-war protest in Washington, D.C. And it calls high school students to join a delegation that is going alongside with that protest. Now, what's interesting is this is double-sided. One side is clearly for the Vietnam Peace Parade Committee, with an order form for tickets that should be returned to the Peace Parade Committee. But the other side calls high school students to go to Washington, listing their own rationale, their own agenda, and providing contact information for the high school student union. So who printed this? Again, probably high school students using material at the Vietnam Peace Parade Committee offices. Who did they print it for? They printed it for the Peace Parade Committee, but also for themselves. I mean, maybe they were just like, hey, there's a blank side on this flyer. Let's put our own thing here. And why did they make it? This is an opportunity to see how the high school student union is really asserting itself, not only wanting to participate and support the Peace Parade Committee, but to steer its own course, to have its own delegation, and to articulate its own list of demands. My next flyer here was produced in the spring of 1969. And this comes back to New York City school issues. It explains that students see this struggle over control of schools, taking control back from police, from teachers' unions, from real estate, and from bankers. Who made this? Again, this is where actually our list of high school student groups is even getting longer, and the list of who put this flyer together. So we have the High School Student Union, the Black Student Union, the High School Coalition, the Afro-American Students Union, and the High School Free Press is listed as its own separate organization here. So in contrast to that IS 201 flyer that was made by non-high school students on behalf of grade school issues, this flyer is being produced by grade school students that attend the schools concerned. And who did they make it for? This is interesting also because the title on this flyer seems to catch the attention of parents. But the flyer is less of an explainer about the issues than a cry for action and solidarity amongst high school students themselves. So it's really like getting the whole range of folks who have a stake in K-12 schools. And in this era, even while we see the huge success of publications like the High School Free Press, individual schools continued or began publishing their own newspapers. The first of these, which I don't have on here, was Sans Culottes. It came out of Bronx High School of Science, and I think it started publishing around 63 or 64. And a really interesting thing about the High School Free Press is their whole economic model. I mean, economic model is a strong word for it, but they distributed bundles of the High School Free Press for free at high schools around the city and told those students, sell this, give it away if you want, or sell it for whatever you want, and use that money to put out your own school's publication or to organize your own rallies. So who made all of these? These are all like 8.5 by 11 mimeographed, stapled, bound mostly publications produced by students within their schools or after the publications got officially banned at their schools in their own homes. And who were they made for? Each is specific to the population of one specific school. Sometimes they would, work with another high school nearby, but mostly one school. And this is actually another example of this. This is a large, uncut, unfolded sheet of Ripoff, which was produced by students at Taft High School in the Bronx. This is another example of what we just saw, but one thing that's really notable about this is that it was not printed at Taft High School, it was not printed at the homes of school students, but it was printed in the print shop at New York University during the occupation in May 1970. And I spoke with one of the organizers of that occupation, and he explained that they realized that they needed to be supporting high school activists. They needed to be bringing high school activists into that space, sharing resources with them as equals, because it wasn't going to be that long until those kids were out of high school and working alongside them on other issues. So this was made by students at Taft High School, but it was printed with the support of radical printers and occupiers, and maybe like the involuntary support of NYU using all of their equipment. And who's it for? It is still specifically addressing the interests and issues of students at Taft High School, some of which mention broader issues of the anti-war movement, but it's really still specific to that school. And we can see this is the first issue that we were just seeing on the left. This is a cut and folded copy of it. And then the second issue is on the right. I believe that one was also printed at NYU. And so these really bring us back where we started. This poster that was printed in the print shop, the occupied print shop at NYU, with this call for high school students to unite, which I think we can agree they did. And so I want to wrap up with some concluding thoughts on that. I do think we can see by asking these really specific questions about the ephemera we're working with, how participation has shifted over time from letting high school students participate on the terms of other organizations or letting them act in service to adult-led groups, to participation of high school students on their own terms about their own concerns. And I mean, maybe this is a thing I think about as like a librarian and archivist who categorizes things a lot. I think a lot of these things would maybe get like the same subject term in the library catalog, the same descriptive terms in an archival finding aid, and we would understand it all as part of this larger radical left history. But when we ask really specific questions about the production of ephemera, who made it, who it was made for, why it was made, we start to see a much more nuanced story about struggles for self-determination and a desire by young people to speak for themselves. And I also realized as I was thinking about this that I've actually made some of my own assumptions about this that, you know, maybe we can talk about. I'm assuming here that production of ephemera is a signal that producers hold power and are exercising self-determination. I think that translates to a lot of other contexts. Maybe we could disagree about that in a friendly way. And I'm also really curious about how we can bring even more nuance to this by diving into more specific questions and reading more between the lines of ephemera to look more at the power plays and the nuance over participation and self-determination. So I know we are almost at lunch, and I am sure everyone's excited for that, but I would love to hear any questions or comments or ideas, things this has made you think of in other material you work with, or anything like that.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah, there you are.
Have you ever met and talked to any of the students who are involved in this production and heard what they think about their activities in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, I mean, the folks I've spoken to are like, yeah, that is who I am today. There was actually, in 2009 at Columbia University, there was a reunion of the high school student union. And I've spoken with folks who were there. I've also, there were some oral histories that were done there, and I've listened to a lot of those. And so all of those folks were asked in their oral histories what they thought the impact had been on them, like 40 years later, how it had impacted their career trajectory. And all of them were like, I still do this kind of organizing. You know, I ended up working like in a union. Everybody that I have heard from who was involved in this still feels like it really shaped the trajectory of their life. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I have several questions, but I'll leave it with two. Have you talked to any of these related high schools about this material, and what has the response been, if you have?
I haven't managed to find high schools that have enough of an archive for there to be any institutional memory.
No, have you talked to the students about what happened at their high schools?
Yeah. I have a little bit. I'm trying to think. I don't think I've talked with any of... So I used to work a lot with schools across Brooklyn. I was working at the public library doing educational work on local history with public schools across Brooklyn, and none of the schools here in this were Brooklyn schools. But all of those schools, frequently I would have teachers say to me, you're coming in to work with my 11th graders, I want to talk about community activism, and we would look at whatever we could find from the community as a whole, but also from their own school. And sometimes that is in forms of ephemera like this, sometimes it's in local newspapers, like community newspapers that are still around. Yeah, it's really amazing to be able to talk to students today about like this legacy in their own school building 40, 50 years ago.
And for something like the Free Press, which sounded like it lasted a couple of years, was that really driven by a couple of people and then they graduated and it didn't continue?
Yeah, so you see these like frequent calls in the newspaper for more help because like the editorial staff has either graduated or dropped out. And they were really committed to it still being published by high school students, so they didn't feel that it was right to remain involved after graduation. And so there were a few cycles of editorial groups. There was also, right towards what I think is the end of the newspaper in the first half of 1970, there was a group of female high school students who, I mean, this is another like challenge to participation that was happening at the time with women saying like we're not being allowed to participate on equal terms. So even the female high school students took over the high school free press and put out their own issue to say like we want to put this out on our own terms and talk about our own issues. So they did have groups cycle through for a few years, and then I think it did peter out just because everyone kept graduating or dropping out.
I guess I was just wondering if you could talk about kind of circulation within the schools. Like, was it accepted? Were there attempts by administration to shut it down? Things like that.
Yeah, it was not accepted, and it was the administration really worked to shut it down. And so then you see, on like when I've been able to see successive issues of something put out from the same school, they'll be like maybe very clear in the second or third issue. This is not the newspaper of such and such high school. It's being put out in Paul's basement because they don't want to get like suspended again. And then sometimes it's actually really hard to tell exactly which high school something's come from because I'm not looking at the first issue and they're being really cagey about their school association in later issues because they don't want to get suspended again. So definitely there was a lot of crackdown on that. And that's something that you see in high school newspapers across the country at that time. Mostly they were quite unofficial.
Thank you. I had a question about the artwork and illustrations that are a part of the especially the New York High School Free Press. There was that cover image of the black baby. Yeah. I think that's a flag that the child.
It is a flag. I think it's just a black flag.
And do you know the provenance of the images? And I know some I saw were like signed. I think one of the later ones, or one of the last things you said, it looked like the person, the columnist signed their artwork as well. Yes, I'm guessing just my question is about the visuals and their provenance. And do you know of any of these folks? Did they go on to be artists or illustrators? Because you said you talked to some of these individuals. Thank you.
Yeah, I know this is the younger sibling of one of the founders of the High School Free Press. I do not know this child's name. I think their older sibling was named Dana. And I have also heard a recorded oral history of someone named Jean Elks, who was one of the main photographers for the Free Press. So they had photographers. They were out there taking their own pictures. Occasionally they would reuse, through the Underground Press Syndicate and Alternative Press Service, they were sometimes getting, not too often, but sometimes getting content from other newspapers, and you would see credit to that. But a lot of it was, self.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Hi. In the earlier part of your talk, when you were speaking about other groups co-opting the energy of these high school students, maybe I missed it, but did you find any references in those other organizations' papers to activating the high school students? And, this is a good way to train them, or this is a good way to add oomph to our current activities, or anything like that? Any specifics?
That did specifically come up at one of the SDS national conventions, and I forget if it was like 65 or 66. They were really having conversations of like, oh, what do we do about these high school students? We should probably like get them to support our cause, but we don't really know how. And their solution to that was largely like trying to send organizers into all the high schools, and generally the student activists in the high schools rejected those SDS organizers, feeling like they were completely out of touch with their own concerns. So SDS is the group that I think took the lead on that, and did have those pretty specific conversations that I've read about in minutes or in autobiographies of like SDS individuals. Yeah.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. Did you make any connection between those high school students and the activism in CUNY? I was at Hunter College during the fiscal crisis, and there was a lot of activism when they imposed tuition on what had been a free university. I wondered if there was any overlap in your research.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. What I have found of that is these high school activists graduating from high school, going to City College, Queens College, or wherever, and being very involved there. I haven't seen as much specific, like, the high school local chapter here is going to work with the CUNY chapter here. That may have happened, and I haven't seen it, but I know a lot of these high school activists grew up and became CUNY graduates or CUNY dropouts.
Right. Is there a lot of ephemera about that era in CUNY? I imagine there must be.
Yes, there's someone I can connect you with who's based at the Grad Center who's doing a lot of work on creating an archive of, she works on the like CUNY Institutional History Archive, but then she's been doing a lot of research specifically on the activism of that era. Yeah. And I think there's one here, yeah.
One thing that struck me was the professionalism of the high school free press and the clear distinction between all of the other more DIY appearance of the other publications. And I'm wondering if that represents any kind of division, ideological or any other between, if you could even characterize the made in Paul's basement kind of stuff and the high school free press.
That's a good question. I think that I've heard conflicting things on this. I think some folks didn't see much of a division. They just recognized that the high school free press had access to like a different kind of resources. I have also heard folks say in interviews like, sure, there was the high school free press coming out, but that was in Manhattan and I was in Jamaica, Queens, and we had our own school newsletter because like that was so far away from us. So sometimes I know that like for some local high schools, the high school free press did not feel as connected to their concerns, but they were still passing it out on campus. Like, yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, I think there's one over there. Yeah.
Thanks, Jen. I think analyzing ephemera with the three questions that you were asking is always helpful. One question that always fascinates me and usually stumps me is how many were made. And so I was struck by one slide that you showed that actually indicated 5,000 copies.
50,000, yeah.
Or 50,000,
Yeah.
Which made me think that was either a massive high school or it was intended to spill well beyond the borders of the audience. So my question is, have you found other examples where production runs are known?
I have, let me think. In talking with the people who were involved in printing stuff at the NYU print shop when it was occupied, like they could tell me, we printed this many tens of thousands or this many hundreds of thousands of this thing. But I have mostly only found that kind of thing out by talking to the printers who did the printing and have a tendency to remember that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's it. Maybe it's time for lunch. Okay. Woohoo!